December 1883, Nebraska prairie. Where the horizon swallows everything and winter doesn't ask permission to kill, the storm came like a war, wind screaming at 70 miles per hour. Temperature plunging to -25 in 2 hours, snow moving horizontal, turning the world white, then erasing it completely inside the town of Elkhorn, walls cracking under the pressure, stoves burning full blast, families huddled against cold that found every gap, every weakness, creeping through wood and glass like something alive, something patient, something that knew exactly how long it would take to freeze a child's blood. 4 miles south, beneath 5 feet of Nebraska earth, a girl sits alone in darkness, 15 years old, orphaned, cast out, living in a hole the town calls a grave. Her floor is warm, impossibly warm, and in 6 hours, when the cold breaks men twice her age, when houses that stood for decades surrender to wind and ice, 17 people will arrive at her door. Desperate, freezing, carrying children who've stopped breathing right. They'll pound on wood they once mocked, beg for shelter in the grave they laughed at, and discover that sometimes the earth keeps promises people won't. December 1883, Nebraska. 4 miles outside Elkhorn, the kind of cold that turns spit to ice before it hits the ground. Beth heard the pounding before she opened her eyes. Not wind. Wind didn't knock. Wind didn't wait. Ember's growl cut through the darkness. Low, steady. The kind of sound that meant danger wore a human face. She pushed off the sleeping platform, still warm beneath her palms. 80 degrees maybe. The clay tiles doing exactly what her father's drawings promised they would. Which meant the system worked. Which meant she wasn't crazy. Which meant all those people in town calling this place. The grave were about to eat their words, frozen solid. The pounding came again. Desperate now, Beth climbed the entrance ramp. Snow had drifted 3 feet deep across the opening. She dug through with bare hands. Ice bit into her fingers. Didn't matter, someone was out there. In this. In -25 with 70-mile winds that could strip flesh from bone. She shoved the door open. The man standing there. She knew him. Of course she knew him. You don't forget the face of someone who throws you out with $9 and tells you your dead father left you nothing worth keeping. Christopher Martinez. 6 feet of self-righteous fury wrapped in a frozen coat. And in his arms, a child, 5 years old maybe. Blue lips, skin the color of ash, wrapped in blankets that had turned to ice-stiffened boards. His daughter, Becky, the youngest of the 6 children he'd chosen over her 4 months ago. Christopher's eyes met hers. No words. What could he possibly say? That she'd been right. That the town had been wrong. That this hole in the ground he'd mocked was the only reason his daughter still had a pulse. Beth stepped aside. Warm air rolled out of the dugout like visible proof. 50 degrees meeting -25. Vapor bloomed between inside and outside. The earth itself seemed to exhale. But this isn't the remarkable part. The remarkable part is what Beth found 2 weeks earlier, buried 18 inches below the surface. In a rusted tin box her father had hidden before the diphtheria took him. A letter, a set of drawings. A secret that changed everything she thought she knew about why she was here. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's go back. Back to August. Back to when it all started. April 1881. Beth was 13 when her mother stopped breathing, Tuesday morning. Margaret Williams had been coughing for 3 days. By Monday night she couldn't stand. By Tuesday dawn she was gone. Just gone. Like someone had reached into their small farmhouse and extracted the one thing holding it all together. Robert Williams held his wife's hand until it went cold. Then he walked outside, stood in the Nebraska wind, came back in and told Beth they'd bury her mother on Wednesday. He died Sunday. The diphtheria didn't care that he was strong. Didn't care that he read engineering books and sketched heating systems in the margins. Didn't care that his daughter needed him. Disease is efficient that way. Removes what matters. Leaves the rest to sort itself out. Beth stood between 2 fresh graves in the Norwegian church cemetery. 13 years old. Orphaned. Owned nothing but the dress on her back and her father's last words ringing in her skull. The earth never lies, Beth. People will. But the earth never lies. She didn't understand. Not then. The bank took the farm within a month. Unpaid debts, foreclosure papers, men in suits who didn't look at her when they inventoried everything her parents had built. 80 acres of poor Nebraska grassland. Gone. Sold. Erased like her family had never existed. Aunt Patricia came to the auction, Margaret's older sister. 40 miles north with a chicken farm and a face that apologized for existing. Your mother would want you with family. Patricia's hands shook when she said it, like she knew this was a mistake but couldn't see another path. You'll stay with me. Help with the farm. It won't be forever. 2 years. Same difference when you're 13 and everything you loved is buried or sold. Patricia's farm was 12 miles from anywhere that mattered. 20 chickens, a sagging barn, a house that leaked cold through every crack, and work. Endless work. The kind that turns a child's hands into leather and teaches them the exact price of survival. Beth fed chickens before dawn, hauled water until her shoulders screamed, mended fences, scrubbed floors, cooked meals for Patricia and herself, got a straw mattress in the corner of the main room, got enough food to keep breathing, got nothing else, no wages, no future. Just existence day after day until what? Until she could marry some farmer's son who needed free labor. Until she could find domestic work in a town that already had too many desperate girls. Until she could what? Vanish into the same anonymous poverty that had swallowed her parents. Then Patricia married Christopher Martinez. Beth heard them talking through the thin walls the night he proposed. Patricia's voice soft and uncertain. Christopher's voice like a hammer driving nails. I have 6 children who need a mother. I have a wheat farm that needs managing. I have no time for romance and less for waiting. Patricia said yes. Of course she said yes. 40-year-old spinster with a failing chicken operation doesn't turn down a proposal from a successful farmer. Even if his eyes are cold. Even if his first wife died in childbirth, and he talks about her like she was livestock that didn't perform. Even if the wedding was small. Practical. Christopher moved Patricia to his place the same week. Beth came too. Nobody asked if she wanted to. Property transfers with the deed. Christopher looked at her exactly once. The day she arrived. Looked at her the way you look at furniture someone else bought and stuck in your house without asking. Extra. Unwanted. In the way. He pulled Patricia aside that first night. Beth heard every word through the bedroom wall. The girl has to go. Patricia's voice cracked. But she's Margaret's daughter. My sister's only child. We can't just. We can. We will. I have 6 children to feed. I won't take on a 7th who isn't mine. She's 15, old enough to work, old enough to find her own way. The argument lasted 11 minutes. Patricia lost. Of course she lost. She lost the moment she said yes to a man who saw people as assets or liabilities, and nothing in between. Beth lay on her straw mattress and stared at the ceiling and felt something hard form in her chest. Not anger exactly. Anger was too hot, too loud. This was colder, denser. The kind of thing that settles in your bones and changes the temperature of your blood. August 28, 1883. Patricia woke her before dawn. Red eyes, shaking hands. A face that knew it was about to do something unforgivable. Beth, I'm sorry, Christopher says. He says you need to find work in town. I spoke to some people. The hotel might need kitchen help. The Johansson family sometimes hires girls for laundry. You're strong, you'll manage. She pressed $9 into Beth's palm. 9. As if that number had any meaning against the size of the world. It's all I could save. Patricia's voice cracked. I'm sorry, I should have fought harder. But he's my husband now and I have to. Have to what? Choose him over blood. Choose stability over conscience. Choose the easy lie that tells you abandoning a 15-year-old girl is somehow her fault for existing. Beth took the money. Took a wool blanket that smelled like chicken feathers. Took the clothes she was wearing. Left everything else. Christopher stood in the doorway watching her go. Didn't help, didn't speak, just watched with those dead eyes until she was 10 feet down the road. Then he called out. One sentence, just one. The kind that sticks in your ribs like a blade you can't extract. Your father died in debt and left you nothing. You're nobody's burden but your own. Beth walked. Didn't look back. Didn't cry. Crying was for people who still believed the world might bend toward mercy. She knew better now. The road stretched empty and August hot beneath her feet. 12 miles to Elkhorn. 12 miles to find out if she was strong enough to prove Christopher Martinez wrong, or broken enough to prove him right. Elkhorn had 26 buildings. 1 church. 1 general store. 1 boarding house run by Sharon Clark who'd made a profession out of Christian charity that stopped precisely where her business interests began. Beth stood on the boarding house porch, $9 in her pocket. Blisters forming on her heels. The sun already high enough to want to make her wool blanket feel like punishment. Sharon opened the door. took one look, shook her head before Beth could open her mouth. I heard about you. The Martinez situation. Can't take in strays. Bad for business. People talk. People always talk. That was the machinery of small towns. Gossip as currency. Reputation as weapon. And Beth's reputation had already been shaped by Christopher's version of events. The ungrateful niece. The burden on a hard-working family. The girl who couldn't earn her keep. Nobody asked for Beth's side. Why would they? She was 15, female, poor. The holy trinity of invisible. She tried the hotel. No work. The general store. Nothing. 3 farms within walking distance. Every door closed before she finished asking. Every window curtain shifted as she passed. People watching, judging, deciding she was someone else's problem. By evening, Beth sat on a rock 4 miles outside town. Quarter section of land nobody wanted. Poor soil. Isolated location. Too far from water. Too far from everything. She had $9. A blanket. Blistered feet. And a choice that didn't feel like choosing. Go back to Patricia's house. Beg. Sleep in the barn maybe. Work for free. Prove Christopher right that she was nobody's burden, but a burden nonetheless. Or what the wind picked up. Smelled like grass and dust. And the particular emptiness of Nebraska in late summer. Beth pulled the blanket tighter. Not because she was cold. Because holding something felt better than holding nothing. Then her father's voice. Not memory exactly. Deeper than that. Like it was coming up through the ground itself. The earth never lies, Beth. She looked at the empty land. Prairie grass. Sandy loam beneath the sod. A creek 2 miles east. And suddenly she understood. Not what her father meant. What he'd taught her. Without meaning to. Without knowing she'd need it. All those books he read. All those experiments he ran. All those nights he sat sketching heating systems while neighbors called him crazy. He'd shown her something. Something about heat. About waste. About capturing what everyone else threw away. The brick kiln he'd built. Testing clay for a neighbor. Firing bricks at 1200 degrees. And the smoke. The smoke that escaped from that kiln still measured 300 degrees when it hit the air. 300 degrees of pure wasted heat pouring into nothing. What if you could catch it? Channel it. Use it before it escaped. Her father had tried. Built a small test system for the chicken coop. Clay pipes running beneath the roost. Smoke from a cooking fire traveling horizontally through buried channels. Heating the tiles heating the earth warming the floor above. All before the exhaust finally escaped through a chimney. It had worked. Beautifully, efficiently. The neighbors had laughed, called it a waste of time. But Beth remembered watching her father adjust the pipe angles, calculate the proper grade, mix mortar in exact ratios, remembered him explaining it, patient and excited in a way that made other farmers shake their heads. Heat rises naturally, Beth. But you can make it travel sideways first, through channels. Exhaust smoke from a cooking fire is still hot, 300 degrees, enough to warm clay and stone. You can trap waste heat, use it for free heat. From fires she'd need for cooking anyway. Beth stood up, looked at the worthless land around her, did the math in her head. A shovel, $2. 20 drainage tiles, the kind farmers used for field work, $3. A small iron cooking grate, $1. $3 left for food. She could dig a dugout, 5 feet deep, insulated by earth. Install a floor heating system, clay pipes buried beneath her sleeping platform, carrying waste heat from cooking fires, warm bed, heated floor, free fuel. It was insane, obviously. A 15-year-old girl with $9 building an underground house with a heating system, based on principles her dead father had sketched in the margins of engineering books. Insane. Or it was the only rational choice she had left. This is my home. Beth said it out loud to the empty prairie, to the wind, to the earth that never lied. This is my home and I'm staying. September 1, 1883. Beth started digging. The prairie sod was brutal. Roots matted into an almost impenetrable layer. She chopped with the shovel edge. Broke the sod into blocks. Removed them piece by piece. Her hands blistered on day 1. Bled by day 2. By day 3 she could barely grip the handle beneath the sod. Sandy loam. Easier to dig but endless. Shovelful. Climb out. Dump earth on the perimeter. Climb back down. Again until her back locked. Until her shoulders burned. Until she couldn't remember what it felt like to not hurt. The hole deepened. 1 foot. 2, 3. September 3. She ran out of food. Cooked her last cornmeal as thin porridge over a fire of dried grass and buffalo chips. After that, wild turnips from the creek bank. Bitter, Fibrous, enough to keep her stomach from seizing. Not enough to call food, her body began to fail. The blisters tore open, raw skin cracked deeper, every grip sent pain shooting to her elbows. She wrapped her hands in strips torn from her skirt hem. The cloth soaked through within hours. 3 feet deep, she needed 5. Needed walls and a roof and a firebox, and 14 feet of buried clay pipe and a chimney and a sleeping platform. Needed everything, had almost nothing, and her body was giving out on the 5th night. Temperature dropped to 34. Beth lay under her blanket in the shallow depression beside the pit. No shelter above her, just open sky, stars sharp and cold and impossibly far. She had 3 matches left, her fingers too numb to work the flint method her father taught her. Too damaged to grip the steel striker, too weak to do anything but gamble everything on 3 small sticks of wood. First match broke. Second caught wind and died. 1 left. Beth cupped her bleeding hands around the match head. Turned her body to block the wind. Remembered her father kneeling beside the chicken coop, showing her how to arrange tinder. Loose enough for air, tight enough to catch. She struck the match. The flame caught. She lowered it with hands, shaking so badly, she nearly dropped everything. The dried grass smoked, glowed orange, caught. Within 10 minutes she had fire. Within 20, warmth enough to stop shivering. She boiled creek water in her small tin pot. Drank it hot with nothing in it. Tasted like earth and iron, but the warmth spread through her chest and into her fingers, and she felt her body remember what being alive meant. Morning came. She set snares for rabbits. Her father showed her when she was 11. Bent willow branches, loops of twisted cord along game trails near the creek. By dusk, the 3rd snare held a cottontail, maybe 3 pounds. She skinned it with her small knife, roasted it over the fire, ate every piece of meat, boiled the bones for broth. Drank the broth. Felt protein enter her blood like resurrection. She could do this, had to do this. There was no one coming. But someone did come. September 6, morning. Beth was in the pit when she heard footsteps. A boy, maybe 12, skinny. Clothes torn, shoes 2 sizes too big. Standing at the edge looking down with eyes too old for his face. I'm Joshua Moore. People call me Josh. Heard you need help digging. I can work. 25 cents a day. Beth looked at his thin arms. His serious expression, the desperate mathematics in his stance. I don't have 25 cents, 15, no 10. She stopped. Why do you want this? Josh looked at the ground. My pa left last month. My ma's sick, my sister's 6. We need money. The truth in his voice, naked and unashamed. The kind of honesty that comes when pride is already gone. 10 cents a day. Beth heard herself say it. But I only pay after I sell rabbits. Can you wait? I can wait. From that day forward, Josh came every morning, dug from 7 until noon. Went home to care for his sister. Came back in the afternoon, dug until sunset. 2 people, faster than 1, but still smudged dirt. So much body-breaking labor that turned days into one long continuous ache. Not 5 days like the story would later claim. 6 weeks, 42 days of digging, of bleeding, of not giving up because giving up meant Christopher Martinez was right about everything. Week 2, after 3 feet down, Beth's shovel struck something hard. She knelt, brushed away loose soil with her fingers. A tin box, small, rusted, buried deliberately about 18 inches deep. Josh stopped digging, watched as she pried it open. Inside, a small, leather-bound journal, slightly damp but intact. Pages covered in handwriting she recognized immediately. The tall, slanted letters, the way the lowercase she curled back on itself. Her father's hand. Beth opened to the first page. Her chest went tight. March 1881, if I don't return. This land is for Elizabeth. I have surveyed it, drawn the designs. Everything is here. If you're reading this, you know what to do, Father. She turned the page. Detailed drawings, cross-section of a dugout, dimensions, depths, firebox position, the path of the clay pipes, angle of descent, ratio of clay to sand for the joint mortar, depth of river stone coverage. Her father had designed a heated dugout for this exact piece of land. He'd planned to build here, had surveyed the ground, calculated the angles, measured the distances. Then diphtheria came and took everything. Everything except the knowledge Robert Williams had taught Beth, piece by piece, lesson by lesson. In a language made of clay and stone and fire that disease couldn't steal. What's it say? Josh was staring. Beth pressed the journal to her chest. My father. He was going to build this. Before he died, he left me the plans. Josh nodded. Like finding your dead father's buried instructions for surviving alone was perfectly normal. Guess we better finish digging then. Something cracked open in Beth's chest. Not tears. Something deeper. The understanding that she wasn't finding this land by accident. Wasn't remembering her father's lessons by chance. He'd planted a seed in her memory and a plan in the earth, both waiting patiently for her to arrive. She wasn't building something new. She was finishing what her father started. Week 2. Thursday. People came to look. Sharon Clark organized it. Mentioned at the general store that someone ought to check on that poor Williams girl. Within an hour, 5 women were walking out to the clay. They brought nothing. No food. No tools. No help. Just curiosity wearing the mask of Christian concern. They stood at the edge of the pit, peered into the dim space below. Earthen walls. Sod-lined room. Crude sleeping platform. Small firebox with clay tiles disappearing into the floor. The smell of damp earth and wood smoke. Lord have mercy. Sharon's voice loud enough to carry across the flat prairie. The girl is living in a grave. The name spread through Elkhorn by evening. Half the town called it Williams' Folly. The other half called it the grave. 2 weeks later. A boy from the general store rode out on his father's horse. Sat in the saddle looking down at Beth hauling sod blocks. Mr. Harris wanted me to tell you. Folks are calling your place the Folly. He put it on the map he keeps behind the counter. Marked it Williams' Folly with a little cross next to it, like a grave marker. He laughed, rode away. Didn't correct the map. Nobody did. Beth went back to work. Let them laugh. Words couldn't hurt her. Not anymore. She'd already survived everything that actually mattered. Week 3. Jonathan Miller appeared without announcement. 17 years old, apprentice blacksmith, Swedish descent. Shoulders already too wide for his frame. He carried an armload of metal. Brackets, pins, hinges, surplus from the forge. His voice careful. Thought you might need them. Not surplus. Beth knew he'd made these for her. Specifically. The angles too precise, the measurements too exact. This was custom work and they both knew it. She didn't call him on it. Jonathan installed the hinges, checked the pipe joints, worked quietly, precisely, in a way that reminded Beth of her father, though she wouldn't have said so out loud. At the door he paused. The floor's warm. It works. I know it works. I'm telling you it's good. You should hear someone say it. He left before she could respond. Beth stood in the empty dugout, put her hand on her chest, felt her heartbeat doing something strange, faster, unsteady. The kind of thing that happened when what? When a boy with kind eyes told you your impossible dream was actually good. Stop. She said it out loud. Stop right now. Her heart didn't listen. Week 4, an old woman appeared. 71. Walking with a cottonwood cane. Living alone in a sod house 3 miles distant. Kathleen Wright. She'd heard the talk at the general store. The orphan living in a hole. Most people laughing. Kathleen wasn't. She walked to the edge of the pit. Looked down without announcing herself. Beth looked up. Thin girl. Hands wrapped in bloody rags. Dirt on her face. Hollow cheeks. Eyes too old for 15. You're the Williams girl. Kathleen's voice like gravel. Your father was Robert Williams. Yes, ma'am. Kathleen studied the pit. The sod blocks stacked along the perimeter. The clay tiles arranged under cloth near the supplies. Then she looked at Beth with an expression the girl couldn't read. You're building a floor heating system. Not a question. A statement. Yes, ma'am. My father taught me the principle. Hot exhaust from a cooking fire, directed through buried clay channels under the sleeping platform. The smoke heats the tiles. The tiles heat the earth. The earth heats the bed. Kathleen was quiet for a long time. The wind moved through the grass. Neither of them spoke. Your father talked about this years ago. At the Norwegian church social, people thought he was crazy. Heating systems in Nebraska. She paused. I didn't think he was crazy. She set a clay pot on the ground. Porridge. Eat before you fall over. Then she looked at the tile arrangement, shook her head. Your joints are too wide. Clay mud won't hold if you don't mix sand in a 2-to-1 ratio. Let it cure 3 days before you run heat through it. Or the whole thing cracks. Beth stared. I'm old, Kathleen said. Not useless. Eat the porridge. I'll come back Thursday. She turned and walked away without looking back. Thursday, Kathleen returned, with knowledge, in Germany. She sat on the edge of the pit. Her knees wouldn't allow the descent. I worked with my husband. He was a construction engineer. Built bridges, built houses. Everyone thought he was brilliant. She smiled. Dry, humorless. He was brilliant, but he didn't work alone. Every design, every calculation, every innovation. I did it, drew it, figured it out. Under his name, because women can't be engineers. By law, By society. By men who make the rules. He died in 1870. I came to America. Thought it would be different here. She looked at Beth. It wasn't. Why are you telling me this? Because you're building. Under your name. With your hands. With your father's knowledge, but your own strength. And no one's going to take that from you. I'll make sure of it. Over the next 3 weeks. Kathleen taught Beth everything the journal didn't contain. The exact angle of descent. 1 inch per 12 inches. Too steep and smoke rushes through without transferring heat. Too flat and smoke stalls, the mortar ratio. 2 parts clay, 1 part sand. Mixed wet, applied thick. Cured for 72 hours minimum, the depth of earth cover. 8 inches above the tiles. Enough to distribute weight. Not so much it blocks heat transfer, the river stone placement. 300 pounds beneath the sleeping platform. Absorbing heat from tiles. Releasing it slowly for 6 to 8 hours after fires die. The firebox orientation, northwest corner. Prevailing winds wouldn't blow into the opening. Smoke would travel naturally toward the opposite corner where the chimney would stand. By late September, the excavation was complete. 5 feet deep, 14 feet long, 10 feet wide. 140 square feet of underground space. Beth's hands had developed calluses over the wounds. Her back had adapted. She'd lost weight she couldn't afford to lose. But she was standing. The heating system came next. She positioned the firebox in the northwest corner, 2 feet square, lined with flat creek stones. Laid the first clay tile at the firebox opening, 6 inches diameter, 12 inches long. Angled slightly downward, 1 inch of drop over 12 inches of length. The balance her father had calculated. Too steep, too flat. The difference between working and failing till by tile, 20 of them. End to end. Joints sealed with clay mud. 2 parts clay, 1 part sand. 14 feet of continuous buried channel from firebox to chimney. She covered the tiles with flat stones. Then 8 inches of compacted earth. Then river stones. 20 trips from the creek. 2 miles each way. 300 pounds total. Her shoulders screaming. But the stones were essential. Heat storage. Heat distribution. Heat that would radiate upward for hours after fires died. Above the stone layer. The sleeping platform. Salvage cottonwood boards. 6 feet long. 4 feet wide. 1/4-inch gaps between boards so heat could rise through. She lined the walls with stacked sod blocks. Built the roof from cottonwood poles covered with grass and sod. Cut the entrance as a sloped ramp descending into the pit. A natural cold trap where frigid air would settle instead of flowing into the living space, the firebox. She built with particular care. Stone surround for fire safety. Opening position so smoke would be drawn into the tile channel rather than filling the room. 6 weeks of digging. 3 weeks of building. $9. 1 dead father's knowledge. 1 living girl's refusal to quit by mid-October. It was done. Not pretty. Not comfortable by any standard Elkhorn would call civilized. But it was engineering, based on principles that had heated buildings 2,000 years ago. Adapted for Nebraska. Built by hands that bled, if it worked. Tomorrow, Beth would test it. Light the first fire. See if waste heat could travel 14 feet through buried clay. See if her father's theories could keep her alive through winter. If it failed, she'd freeze when December came if it worked. She'd prove everyone wrong. Sharon Clark. Christopher Martinez. Every person who'd looked at a 15-year-old orphan and decided she was already dead. The earth never lies. Beth pressed her palm against the cool clay tiles, felt the weight of everything riding on this. Her father's legacy, her own survival. The difference between being right and being another cautionary tale people told over dinner. Tomorrow. She'd know tomorrow. Mid-October. Dawn light cutting through the entrance ramp. Beth knelt beside the firebox with 3 small pieces of wood and everything riding on whether her father's theories could survive contact with Nebraska winter. She struck the match, fed the flame. Watched smoke enter the tile opening and disappear into darkness. This was the moment. Either the draft would pull smoke through 14 feet of buried clay, or it wouldn't. Either heat would transfer through tiles to earth, to stone to sleeping platform, or she'd freeze to death in a hole she'd spent 6 weeks digging. Beth walked to the opposite corner, the chimney exit, held her hand near the opening. Hot exhaust emerged, pushed against her palm. The draft was working, pulling smoke through the entire buried channel, heating clay along the full length before releasing it skywardings. Not faith. Her father had been right. 2 hours later, she climbed onto the sleeping platform, pressed her palm flat against the boards. Warm. Not just not cold. Warm. 80 degrees maybe. Heat radiating upward through 8 inches of earth, through 300 pounds of river stone, through gapped cottonwood boards, stored in clay. Released slowly upward into the space where she'd sleep. Beth lay down, pressed her cheek against warm wood, closed her eyes. First time in 7 weeks she was warm without burning fuel she couldn't afford. The cooking fire she needed anyway, heating her bed for free. Thank you, Papa. The words came out broken, not because she was sad, because gratitude sometimes cracks you open the same way grief does. Josh poked his head down the ramp. It work? Beth sat up, grinning. Couldn't help it. Yeah, it works. Told you. You didn't tell me anything. Didn't have to. Josh's smile was pure satisfaction. Your pa was smart. You're smart. Math checks out. He disappeared back up the ramp. Left Beth sitting on her warm platform, in her underground home, that everyone called a grave, that was going to keep her alive through winter. The earth never lies. She said it out loud this time, testing how it felt in her mouth. Solid. True. The kind of thing you could build a life on. October 12. The dump east of Elkhorn, where the town discarded broken things. Bent stovepipes, cracked wheels, torn clothing beyond mending. And a dog, lying beside a heap of rusted cans, thin enough to count every rib, brown and gray, medium build, one ear standing, one folded over. He'd been there long enough to stop expecting anyone to return, but not long enough to stop watching. Not long enough to give up the idea that someone, somewhere, might still want him. He looked at Beth. She looked at him. I can barely feed myself. She said it out loud. To the dog. To the universe. To whatever cosmic accountant kept track of foolish decisions. He thumped his tail once. Against frozen ground, Beth walked away, heading back to the dugout with a salvaged bucket and 3 usable nails. Progress. Small victories. Moving forward, the dog followed. She walked faster. He limped after her, favoring his left front paw, determined in a way that suggested this wasn't negotiation. This was inevitable. Beth stopped, turned around. Fine, but you earn your keep. Understood? The dog sat, looked at her with brown eyes that held no accusation, only patience, as if he had all the time in the world to wait for her to make the right decision. She named him Ember, because she'd survived by striking sparks from stone, and the dog had the same quality: hard, patient, capable of producing warmth from nothing. Ember ate the rabbit bones she couldn't crack for marrow, slept beside the entrance ramp, growled when anyone approached. A warning system that didn't require feeding beyond scraps. That first night he lay beside the firebox, sighed with bottomless contentment. The sound so unexpected Beth laughed out loud. Actually laughed. The noise startled her. She'd forgotten what her own laughter sounded like. Ember looked up at the sound, thumped his tail, put his head back down. Company. Even the 4-legged kind. Even the kind that smelled like the dump and had a bum paw. Company mattered more than she'd realized. November brought inspection. Pastor George Anderson arrived first. 5 church members trailing behind like ducklings, down the entrance ramp. Stopping while their eyes adjusted to dim interior. Dear child. The pastor's voice dripped gentle condescension. You're living underground like an animal. This dugout has no proper heating. That little firebox won't warm this space in January. You need to accept the Johansson family's offer. Kitchen help, room and board. $1 monthly. The dugout has heating. Beth kept her voice level. The tiles under my sleeping platform carry exhaust heat from the cooking fire. The smoke heats the tiles. The tiles heat the earth and stones. The heat radiates into my sleeping area. More efficient than any stove in Elkhorn. Pastor George looked at the clay tiles disappearing into the earthen floor. His expression said everything his mouth was too polite to speak. Poor deluded child. Clay pipes buried in dirt is not a heating system. It's desperation. When the temperature reaches 20 below, you'll freeze in this hole. It's engineering. Adapted for Nebraska conditions. The principle is sound. Please, child. Accept help before it's too late. They left. Beth listened to their footsteps fade up the ramp. Didn't argue. Couldn't argue with people who'd already written your ending. Mid-November. Christopher Martinez came with threats. I hear you're squatting on unclaimed land. He stood at the entrance. Didn't descend. Didn't want to acknowledge this place was real. The land is unclaimed. I checked. A 15-year-old girl can't file a legal claim. I have rights to unclaimed land within 5 miles of my property. For grazing purposes. You're interfering with my livelihood. I'll take this to the land office and the county inspector. This land has been unclaimed for 9 years. You never wanted it. Don't tell me what I want, girl. He turned, walked away, but looked back once, and the expression on his face wasn't anger. It was something more specific, the resentment certain men carry for people who refuse to be defeated in the way they're supposed to be. Ember growled until Christopher disappeared over the ridge. That night, Beth sat alone by candlelight. Thought about the land office, the county inspector. What a man with 6 children and church standing could argue before officials that a 15-year-old orphan girl couldn't counter. She thought about giving up. Walking back to Patricia's house, telling Christopher she'd work for free. Sleep in the barn with the animals. Anything. Just to stop fighting. The temptation was real. Surrender had its own comfort. The warm embrace of choosing defeat before defeat chose you. But then, her father's voice. From the earth, from the walls, from the clay tiles beneath her feet. The earth never lies, Beth. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. We're staying. To Ember. To herself. To the ghost of Robert Williams, who'd believed his daughter was worth more than Christopher Martinez's contempt. We're staying. December 1. Kenneth Taylor arrived, inspector, county land office, 43 years old, efficient, professional. Had already decided what he'd find before he dismounted. A child living in a hole, a hazard, a simple report recommending relocation, home by supper. He descended the entrance ramp, stopped at the bottom, eyes adjusting, saw earthen walls lined with sod blocks, plumb and tight. Cottonwood roof beams overhead, solid and properly spaced. Sleeping platform with gapped boards. Firebox in the northwest corner with clay tiles disappearing into the floor at a precise angle. Chimney shaft rising clean through the earth. The dog watching him with calm, unfriendly eyes. The air was warm. That was the first thing he noticed. Warmer than the land office where he worked. Warmer than his own parlor most December mornings. He hadn't expected that. You're Elizabeth Williams. Yes, sir. 15 years old. Yes, sir. Living alone in an underground structure on unclaimed land. Improved land. I've excavated 5 feet. Installed 140 square feet of living space. Built a functioning heating system. Planted winter turnips. Kenneth looked at the tiles. What is this system? Floor heating. Exhaust from the cooking fire travels through 14 feet of buried clay tile before exiting the chimney. The smoke heats the tiles to 200 degrees. The tiles heat the surrounding earth and stones. The heat radiates upward through the sleeping platform. I cook with the same fire I'd need anyway. The heating costs no additional fuel. Kenneth walked to the firebox, looked at the tile opening, walked to the chimney, looked at the exit, walked back to the sleeping platform. Placed his hand flat on the boards, his eyebrows lifted, almost imperceptibly. But Beth saw it. The platform was warm. 72 degrees on a day when outside temperature was 14. How long does the heat last after the fire dies? 6 to 8 hours. The river stones beneath the platform store thermal energy and release it gradually. Kenneth was quiet. He looked around the dugout again, this time not looking at what he'd expected to find. Looking at what was actually there, the baseline temperature of this space. Without any fire, 50 degrees. Earth insulation at 5-foot depth maintains that temperature regardless of surface conditions. He wrote something in his notebook, closed it, looked at Beth with an expression she couldn't quite read. I'll file my report. The land office will make its determination. I report what I observe. I observed a habitable structure with functional heating, insulated walls, adequate ventilation, evidence of agricultural improvement. He paused. I also observed that this is the warmest building I've entered today. And I've been in 6. He climbed the ramp, mounted his horse, didn't say anything else. But he didn't condemn the dugout either. And Beth understood that sometimes silence from an official was the closest thing to victory a 15-year-old girl was going to get. Garrett Brasquet would receive the inspector's report within a week. It wouldn't say what he wanted it to say. Late November. The betting pool started. 3 young men at the general store. Brandon Scott, Ryan Davis, Thomas somebody Beth didn't know. Placing wagers on when she'd die before Christmas was the favorite. Before New Year paid even money. Before February was the long shot. Nobody wagered she'd survive winter. The longest bet was Valentine's Day. They'd turned her death into entertainment, Jonathan told her. Standing in the dugout installing iron brackets he'd forged, surplus from the shop. Which wasn't surplus, and they both knew it but neither mentioned. They're betting on when you die. His voice tight. Like the words tasted wrong in his mouth. Beth kept working, mixing mortar. Who's they? Brandon, Ryan, some others. I heard it from the store owner's son. Before Christmas is favorite. They think it's funny. Jonathan drove a nail with 3 precise strikes. Harder than necessary. They're fools. What do you think? He stopped hammering, looked at her. I think your floor is warm and their floors are cold. I think come January that'll matter more than what they think. He went back to the bracket. Ember lay in the doorway watching, tail thumping occasionally against earth. Beth felt something shift in her chest. Something warm that had nothing to do with heated tiles. Dangerous, that warmth. The kind that made you hope. And hope was just another way to set yourself up for disappointment. Stop it, she told her treacherous heart. Stop, right now. It didn't listen. Early December. Christopher returned. Not alone this time, a man with a leather satchel, suit vest, city clothes that didn't belong on a Nebraska prairie. This is Mr. Harrison. Christopher's voice carried false courtesy. Attorney from Omaha. Harrison surveyed the dugout with eyes that calculated value. This heating system. Who designed it, my father? Robert Williams. From his research on thermal systems. And he's living? No. Died in 1881. Any patents? Documentation? Official designs? Beth looked at Christopher. Understood now. This wasn't about land. This was about the system. About claiming ownership. About turning her father's knowledge into Christopher's profit. No. No patents then. Harrison's smile was professionally sympathetic. If Mr. Martinez were to occupy this land and install a similar system, there's nothing legally preventing it. In fact, he could file a patent himself. As an adult, since you're a minor, you can't hold patents under territorial law. Christopher's smile was worse than Harrison's. Triumphant, ugly. This system belongs to my father. Beth's voice stayed steady. Belongs to me, not to you. Prove it, Christopher said after they left. Beth pulled out her father's journal. Read every page, every drawing, every calculation. The proof was there, in Robert Williams' handwriting, in dated entries from 1881. But would anyone believe a dead man's journal against a living man's lawyer? Next morning, Jonathan appeared with more iron brackets and information. I spoke to old Henriksen at the land office, his voice careful. Deliberate. Garrett has no grazing claim. The land is unregistered open territory. As long as you're actively improving it, you hold squatters' rights under territorial law. He can't force you off. He will try. Let him. You have a dugout, a heating system, winter turnips in the ground. That's improvement under the statute. Legally defensible. You know a lot about land law for a blacksmith. Jonathan shrugged. My father lost land in Sweden to a man who lied about boundary lines. I learned what my father should have known. He installed the chimney brackets, adjusted the draft cap to prevent wind from reversing smoke flow, checked the tile joints for cracks, worked with the quiet precision that made Beth's chest do that dangerous warm thing again. At the door he paused. Beth, I've been watching you since August. When you came to town, when people closed their doors, when Mrs. Clark turned you away, I wanted to help. But I was afraid. Afraid of what? Afraid you'd refuse me. Afraid I wasn't enough. Afraid. He stopped. I'm not afraid anymore. This system is yours. Your father's legacy. And I'll help you protect it. Why? Because you deserve someone fighting for you. The way you've been fighting for yourself. He left before she could respond. Left her standing in the warm dugout with her heart doing acrobatics and her brain screaming warnings and absolutely no idea which one to believe. December 10. Kathleen Wright arrived with papers instead of porridge. Here. She handed Beth carefully drawn schematics. Copies of your design. I redrew them. From memory. And your father's notes. With your signature. Dated. Witnessed by me. Beth stared at the precise technical drawings. Why are you doing this? Kathleen sat on the sleeping platform. Ember placed his head on her knee. In Germany. My husband was a famous engineer. People thought he was brilliant. They were right. He was. She paused. But he didn't work alone. Every design, every calculation, every innovation, I did it, drew it, figured it out under his name. Because women can't be engineers, by law, by society, by men who make rules. He died in 1870. I came to America. Thought it would be different here. She looked at Beth. It wasn't. I've lived alone. Never built anything again. Under my own name, you're building. Under your name, with your hands, with your father's knowledge but your own strength. No one gets to take that. I'll make sure. Beth pressed the papers to her chest. Thank you. Don't thank me. Kathleen's voice was iron. Just don't quit. That's all the thanks I need. December 13, morning. Animals knew. Ember wouldn't go outside. Beth opened the dugout entrance. The dog planted his legs, refused to climb the ramp. She'd never seen him do this. Ember wasn't fearful. He'd faced down a coyote at the creek bank in October, without backing up. Growled at Christopher with hackles raised and teeth showing, afraid of nothing that walked on legs. But this morning, he pressed himself against the warm sleeping platform, whined, a thin sound from deep in his throat. Wouldn't move. Beth climbed the ramp alone, stood on the prairie, looked at the sky. Wrong. The sky was wrong. Not gray, not white, yellow. The shade of a bruise 3 days old, stretched tight across the horizon from northwest to southeast. The air had weight, pressure. Her ears felt full, the way they did before thunderstorms in summer. Except this was December. No thunder. Something else. Birds were flying southeast. All of them. Not scattered. Deliberate lines. Moving fast and low. Like fleeing something behind them she couldn't see. Beth remembered Kathleen's stories. The blizzard of 1873. How animals knew before people. How cattle turned their backs to the northwest and refused to eat. How dogs crawled under porches and wouldn't come out. How old settlers read these signs and survived while newer families, the ones who trusted thermometers over instinct, died in their houses with full wood piles. She went back inside. Checked food supply. 5 days if careful. Checked wood. 2 weeks at normal burn rate. Checked tile joints. Chimney draft. Entrance ramp. Then walked to town. Had to warn them. Had to try. 90 minutes to Elkhorn on foot. General store first. Donald Harris behind the counter. The man who'd marked William's Folly on his wall map with a cross. There's a storm coming. Beth's voice steady. Bad one. The animals are acting wrong. Pressure's dropping. Skies turned yellow. I think it could be like 1873. You should tell people to prepare. Extra wood inside. Water stored. Animals in the barn. Harris looked at her over his spectacles. Is that so? The Williams girl predicting blizzards now. First she's an engineer. Now she's a weather prophet. He said it to the 2 men by the stove. Not to Beth's. She left. Tried the doctor's office. Dr. Richard Thompson, practical man from Pennsylvania. Believed in science. Thermometers. Very little else. Animals don't predict weather. His voice patient. Like explaining to a slow child. Barometric pressure isn't something a 15-year-old girl reads from a yellow sky. Go home. It's December in Nebraska. Cold weather isn't a catastrophe. The church. Pastor George preparing his Sunday sermon, listening with patient expression of a man being kind by not laughing. Only God knows the weather, Beth. If he intends a storm, we trust in his mercy. If not, then we've worried for nothing. I suggest prayer rather than panic. I'm not panicking. Beth stood in the doorway. I'm warning you. There's a difference. 3 more houses. The Johansons told her to go home. The Miller family said they'd survived 20 Nebraska winters and didn't need advice from a girl living in a hole. At the last house, 2 of the young men from the betting pool were sitting on the porch. Brandon Scott saw her coming, called to his friend. The grave girl's out of her burrow. Must be scared of sunshine. There's a storm coming. Severe one. You should prepare. Darling, the only storm around here is you going door to door telling people the sky's falling. They were still laughing when she turned away. 1 more house. The small clapboard cottage at town's edge, where Walter Calloway lived alone. 78 years old. Veteran of the frontier since the 1840s. Survived everything Nebraska could produce. Developed the particular stubbornness that comes from never being wrong about your own survival. He was sitting on his porch, rocking chair. Blanket on his knees, Mr. Calloway. I believe a severe blizzard is approaching. Possibly tonight. You should stay with someone in town. Or you could come to my dugout. It's warm and protected. Calloway looked at her. Eyes pale blue like ice that had forgotten it was ever water. Hands gripping the rocker arms with swollen knuckles from 50 years of frontier work. Girl, I've survived 50 Nebraska winters. I survived the grasshopper plague of 74. The drought of 64. The blizzard of 73. When men half my age froze solid in their barns. I've buried 2 wives and 3 horses, and I'm still sitting on this porch. I don't need a child to tell me about winter, if you change your mind. My dugout is 4 miles southwest, near the rock outcrop. You're welcome anytime. He said nothing. She left. The walk back took 2 hours. Wind had shifted. Coming from the northwest now. Steady. Cold. Carrying something she could feel against her skin. Not snow. Not yet, but the promise of snow. the weight of what was gathering behind the horizon. Beth descended the ramp, into the dugout. Ember hadn't moved from the platform, looked at her with eyes that held no judgment. "Only confirmation, I know," she said. Nobody listened. She sealed the entrance as best she could, built a fire in the firebox, watched smoke draw perfectly through the tile channel, checked the chimney one final time, sat on the platform with her back against the earthen wall, and waited. The storm hit on the evening of December 14. Didn't arrive gradually, didn't build, didn't warn, came like a wall. One moment wind was 20 miles per hour, steady. The next moment 70. Screaming, Beth heard it from inside the dugout, 5 feet underground. Heard it the way you hear an explosion from inside a basement. A low roar that built and built until it became continuous. Alive. Like the earth itself was being torn apart by hands made of wind and ice. Temperature outside dropped from 12 degrees to -10 within the first hour. By midnight, -25. Wind sustained at 70 miles per hour. Snow falling at 3 inches per hour. Driven horizontal by the screaming gale, visibility dropped to 0. A person standing in that storm couldn't see their own hand held 6 inches from their face. Exposed to that wind would lose sensation in 30 seconds. Frostbite would begin in 2 minutes. Hypothermia within 15. A person caught outside without shelter would be dead in an hour. Maybe less. Beth's dugout. 5 feet underground with 4 feet of earth above the roof. Earth walls on every side. Almost completely isolated from the storm. She could hear the wind as distant muffled roar, vibrating faintly through the soil above her head. Could feel subtle pressure changes. But the storm didn't penetrate 5 feet of Nebraska earth. The entrance ramp filled with drifting snow within the first 2 hours. The snow actually helped. Sealed the opening. Added insulation. Blocked wind from reaching the interior. She was sealed in her underground space with adequate food, water, fuel, and a heating system that functioned independently of anything happening on the surface. She cooked her evening meal as normal. Small fire in the firebox. 4 pieces of wood. Smoke entered the tile channel, traveled 14 feet through buried clay. Heated the tiles to 200 degrees. Transferred heat to surrounding earth and stones. The sleeping platform reached 80 degrees. She ate beans and cornmeal, sitting on warm boards with Ember beside her, while the worst blizzard in a decade raged 5 feet above their heads. The contrast was absolute. Above ground, the world was ending. Wind tore at everything standing. Fence posts snapped, barn doors ripped from hinges. Snow didn't fall, it flew, attacked, moved horizontally at 70 miles per hour, and hit exposed skin like handfuls of thrown sand. Temperature was -25 and dropping toward -30. A world designed to kill anything warm-blooded that couldn't find shelter within minutes. Below ground. Beth peeled a potato. The dugout temperature held at 50 degrees baseline. With her body heat and residual warmth from the tiles, the air in the room stayed 53. Comfortable. Safe. Exactly what her father's design had promised. The earth was keeping its word. The way it always did. Hour 6. Christopher Martinez's house began failing. Wind found every gap in construction, every crack between boards, every space around window frames where caulking had dried and shrunk. Cold air forced through these gaps at 70 miles per hour, creating drafts no stove could overcome. They burned wood continuously, fed the stove every 30 minutes, consumed fuel at an unsustainable rate, and they knew it. But the alternative was stopping. Letting temperature fall to whatever the house would hold without heat, which wasn't enough to sustain life by midnight. The house interior was 42 degrees. Despite burning wood faster than they ever had, Christopher's 6 children were layered in every piece of clothing they owned, wrapped in blankets, pressed against each other and the stove, still cold, still shivering. Their breath visible in the air inside their own home. Becky was the smallest, 5 years old, maybe 38 pounds. Not enough body mass to generate adequate heat. She was showing early symptoms, lethargy, confusion. Her skin had taken on a grayish color that Patricia recognized from stories about the blizzard of 73. Stories that didn't end well. By dawn of December 15. The house was 38 degrees inside. They'd burned half their winter wood supply in 12 hours. At current consumption, they'd run out in 2 more days. Then what? Burn the furniture, burn the shelves, burn the house itself, or freeze to death surrounded by ash. Christopher stood at the window. Watched snow move horizontally past the glass at 70 miles per hour. Couldn't see the barn 40 feet away. Couldn't see the fence. Couldn't see anything except white chaos and wind that screamed without stopping. He thought about the dugout. Heard the Williams girl was surviving out there. Underground. Didn't believe it. Nobody could stay warm underground in -25. Clay pipes and dirt weren't heating. A hole in the ground wasn't shelter. Everything he understood about building and warmth and survival told him the girl was either dead already or would be dead within hours. But Becky's skin was gray, and the house was 38 degrees and falling, and he had no other options. None. Morning of December 16. Day 2. Christopher made the decision that would save his family. They would walk to the dugout. 2 miles through the blizzard. Risk death during the journey, because staying in the house was no longer possible. The cold inside their walls had become as dangerous as the cold outside them. At least the walk offered a chance. The house offered mathematics. And the mathematics said his children wouldn't survive another night. He bundled Becky in every blanket they had. Patricia held the hands of the 2 middle children, ages 6 and 8. Gripping so tight her knuckles went white inside her mittens. The 3 older children, 10, 12, 14, held onto Christopher's coat and each other. Promised not to let go. They opened the front door. The storm hit them like a living thing. The walk was 2 miles. Should have taken 45 minutes on a normal day. It took 90 minutes in the blizzard. Every step was a negotiation with wind that wanted to push them down, and snow that wanted to blind them, and cold that wanted to stop their hearts. Christopher's face was frostbitten within 10 minutes. White patches on his cheeks and nose he couldn't feel. Patricia's fingers went numb inside her mittens. She held the children's hands by memory, because she could no longer feel whether she was gripping or not. The younger children cried until the cold stole their voices. The older children stopped talking, focused on moving one foot, then the next, then the next. Becky was silent. That was the worst part. She'd stopped responding 20 minutes into the walk. Eyes closed, body limp in Christopher's arms. He couldn't tell if she was unconscious or dead. And he couldn't stop to check, because stopping meant dying. They found the dugout by memory and desperation. Christopher knew it was near a rock outcrop. They reached the outcrop, searched frantically in whiteout conditions, stumbling through drifts until one of the older boys found the entrance ramp. Half buried in snow, they dug with their hands, numb fingers clawing through packed snow, found the door, pounded on it with fists that couldn't feel the wood. Beth opened the door. Warm air rolled out of the dugout. 50 degrees meeting -25. Vapor bloomed in the space between inside and outside, like breath made visible, like the dugout itself was exhaling. Christopher looked at her. She looked at him. The last time they'd stood this close, he'd told her she was nobody's burden. Now he was standing in her doorway with a dying child in his arms, and nowhere else on earth to go. Beth stepped aside. 8 people stumbled down the entrance ramp, fell onto the earthen floor of the dugout, snow-covered, frost-covered. Shaking so violently the sound of their bodies trembling against packed earth was audible over the muffled roar of the storm above. Christopher laid Becky on the sleeping platform. The child unconscious, lips blue, skin the color of old ash. Beth didn't ask questions, didn't ask why they were here, how they'd come. Whether Christopher remembered what he'd said on August 28. She built a fire, larger than normal. Extra wood to push maximum heat through the tile system. Within 30 minutes, the tiles reached peak temperature. The sleeping platform climbed to 85 degrees, warm enough to feel against bare skin. She wrapped Becky in her own blanket, placed her on the warmest section, directly above the central tiles. Within an hour, color began returning to the child's face. The confusion cleared, slowly. The way fog lifts from a valley, Becky opened her eyes, looked around the dim space below ground. Earthen walls, sod-lined room, crude sleeping platform, small firebox, the smell of damp earth and wood smoke. It's warm, her voice barely above a whisper. Yes. Beth's throat tight, it's warm. Then more pounding on the door. Sharon Clark and her family. Their roof had partially collapsed under the weight of drifting snow. Her husband carrying their 4-year-old son, who hadn't spoken since the roof came down. The child's eyes open but empty, staring at nothing. Somewhere far away inside himself, somewhere the cold and noise and terror had sent him. And he wasn't coming back on his own. Sharon stood in the entrance of the dugout she'd called the grave, lips moving, no words coming out. She looked at Beth with an expression beyond shame, beyond embarrassment. The face of a woman who understood in a single moment that everything she'd said and believed and repeated to neighbors about this girl had been exactly, precisely, catastrophically wrong. Beth opened the door wider, then Pastor George Anderson. The church windows had shattered inward, blown out by wind that found weakness in the putty and exploited it with the patience of something that had all night. His wife and 2 daughters stood behind him, shaking. The pastor who'd told Beth only God knew the weather, now standing in a hole in the ground, asking a 15-year-old girl to save his family. Beth stepped aside, then the 2 young men from the betting pool, Brandon Scott and Ryan Davis. Alone, no family to protect, just 2 boys, 18 and 19, who 3 days ago had laughed about the grave girl in her burrow. Brandon had tears frozen to his cheeks in white lines. Ryan couldn't speak, couldn't form words, just stood in the entrance and shook. Beth opened the door. 17 people in 140 square feet. Impossible. Barely room to sit. Bodies pressed against bodies, children on the warm sleeping platform, adults against the earthen walls, the air thick with breath and fear, the smell of wet wool, and frozen skin beginning to thaw. Beth didn't say I told you so, didn't say I warned you, didn't say any of the things she'd earned the right to say. She said 4 words, come in, get warm. 4 words from a 15-year-old girl who'd been thrown out like something broken, who'd been mocked, who'd been bet against, who'd been called a grave dweller and a fool and a child playing at survival. 4 words from someone who had every reason to close the door. Let them freeze the way they'd let her freeze 4 months ago when every door in Elkhorn slammed in her face. But Beth wasn't built for revenge. She was built for warmth. Her father had designed her that way. The same way he'd designed the floor heating system. To capture what others wasted. To hold heat when the world went cold. To keep people alive who couldn't keep themselves alive. She turned to the firebox. Began building the fire that would keep 17 people alive through the longest night any of them would ever know. Outside the storm screamed. Inside the earth held. Beth organized children first. 6 of them. Ranging from Becky at 5 to the oldest Martita's boy at 14. She placed them on the sleeping platform, 6 feet by 4 feet, 24 square feet, and she fit all 6 by laying them sideways, head to toe, pressed together like cordwood. The youngest in the center where the tiles ran hottest, the oldest on the edges. Becky she positioned directly above the central tile junction, where temperatures reached 85 degrees. She wrapped the child in both blankets she owned, tucked the edges under the small body to trap heat rising from below. Becky's lips were still blue, breathing shallow and irregular. But breathing, and as long as she was breathing the tiles would do the rest. The adults needed managing too. These were people who 12 hours ago wouldn't have listened to Beth if she told them the sky was blue. Now they stood shivering in her dugout, helpless as children, waiting to be told what to do by the girl they'd mocked. The reversal was total, and none of them had energy to process it. Processing would come later. Survival came first, adults against the walls. Christopher and Patricia on the north side, close enough to the sleeping platform to touch their children. Sharon and her husband on the south, their silent son between them. Pastor George, his wife, 2 daughters near the entrance, where the air was coldest, but where the pastor insisted on being, as though accepting the worst spot was a form of penance he'd already begun to pay. The 2 young men from the betting pool in the remaining corner, pressed shoulder to shoulder, occupying as little space as 2 grown bodies could manage, which wasn't much. Beth built the fire larger than she'd ever built it. 6 pieces of wood instead of her usual 4. She needed maximum heat through the tile system. 17 bodies to warm. The smoke entered the channel. She listened to it draw, that faint whisper of air moving through clay that had become as familiar to her as her own breathing. The draft held. The system worked. It didn't care that there were 17 people instead of 1. Physics didn't count heads. Within 30 minutes, the tiles were at peak temperature. 200 degrees in the clay, the earth surrounding the channel warm and getting warmer. The river stones beneath the platform absorbing heat, like a bank absorbs money, storing it for slow release through the night. The dugout air temperature climbed from 50 to 55 degrees. 17 bodies generating heat. each person producing roughly 300 BTUs per hour, combined with the tile system. The small underground space was warming steadily. Warm enough to stop the shivering. Warm enough to keep blood moving. Warm enough to live. Christopher Martinez sat against the north wall, knees drawn up, no room to extend his legs, his face white with frostbite patches on both cheeks and across the bridge of his nose. Hands swollen and red, the skin cracked from cold in patterns that would take weeks to heal. He was staring at the floor beneath him, the warm floor. He placed his palm flat against the earth, held it there, felt heat radiating upward through the soil from the buried tiles beneath. How is this possible? His voice, damaged by the cold air he'd breathed during the 2-mile walk, didn't sound like a question. Sounded like a man whose understanding of the world had cracked open. Your floor is warm, actually warm. My house with a stove burning continuously couldn't stay above 40 degrees. Your dugout with a cooking fire is 55 and climbing. How? Beth was adjusting the fire, didn't look up. The buried tiles carry exhaust heat from the firebox. Smoke enters the channel at roughly 300 degrees, travels 14 feet through clay, transferring heat to the tiles and surrounding earth and stones. By the time it exits the chimney, it's given up most of its thermal energy. That energy is stored in the earth and stone beneath the sleeping platform, radiated upward over 6 to 8 hours. But my stove, exhaust goes straight up the chimney. Exactly. Your exhaust goes directly outside. Mine travels horizontally through 14 feet of clay first. During that journey, it transfers heat your system throws away. I'm heating this space with waste energy. Heat you pay for and then discard. Christopher was quiet for a long time. He looked at the tiles visible at the firebox opening, looked at the chimney exit in the opposite corner, looked at the sleeping platform where his children lay on warm boards, their shivering slowly subsiding. Color returning to their faces. His youngest daughter, Becky, opened her eyes again, looked around the dim underground space, at the earthen walls, at the bodies pressed against each other, at the candlelight flickering on the low ceiling, at the dog lying beside the platform, watching her with calm brown eyes. It's warm, she said it again, her voice small but clear. The confusion was gone from her eyes. The grayish color had left her skin. She was present, returned from whatever cold place she'd been drifting toward, yes. Beth's voice softer now. It's warm. Go back to sleep. Becky closed her eyes. Beside her, the other Martinez children had stopped shivering. Their breathing had deepened into the steady rhythm of sleep. They were safe, all of them, warm and safe on a heated floor, in an underground room their father had called a hole, and their town had called a grave. The hours passed slowly in the dark. The storm continued above them. They could hear it, that muffled, continuous roar vibrating through the earth. But it was distant now. Another world. The dugout existed outside of the storm, separated by 5 feet of soil and the accumulated patience of the earth itself. Beth maintained the fire through the night. Small, steady additions of wood every 45 minutes. Enough to keep the tiles hot, but not so much that she'd burn through her fuel supply before the storm ended. She calculated and recalculated. 2 weeks of wood for one person. Maybe 5 days for 17 if she was careful. The storm couldn't last more than 3 days, probably. She hoped she didn't sleep, couldn't sleep. 17 lives depending on a firebox and 14 feet of clay tile. And a girl who'd learned physics from a dead man's chicken coop experiment. Around midnight, Sharon Clark's 4-year-old son spoke for the first time since their roof collapsed. The boy had been silent for hours, wide-eyed and rigid in his mother's arms, staring at nothing. Somewhere inside himself, where the sound of splitting timber and howling wind had sent him. Sharon had tried talking to him, singing, rocking. Nothing worked. The child was locked inside his own terror, and no voice from the outside could reach him. Ember reached him. The dog had been lying beside the sleeping platform since the refugees arrived. Calm and watchful, moving only to avoid being stepped on in the crowded space. He hadn't growled at anyone since they entered. Some instinct told him these people weren't threats. They were wounded. Around midnight, Ember stood up, walked to where Sharon sat against the south wall holding her son. The dog pushed his nose gently against the boy's hand. The boy didn't respond. Ember pushed again, then laid his head on the child's lap, heavy and warm and patient. Something shifted behind the boy's eyes. His rigid hand moved slowly, as though remembering how fingers worked. He placed his palm on Ember's head, The fur was warm, the skull beneath solid and real. The dog breathed, and the boy felt the breath expand the ribs beneath his hand. Proof of something alive and gentle and present in a world that had spent the last 12 hours trying to tear itself apart. "Can I keep petting the dog?" The boy whispered. Sharon made a sound, not a word. Something deeper than language. Her arms tightened around her son. She pressed her face into his hair. Her shoulders shook. Around her, in the dim underground space, every adult who heard the boy's first words in 12 hours felt something break open inside their chest. "Yes," Beth's voice steady. "You can pet him as long as you want. His name is Ember." "Ember," the boy repeated. He moved his fingers through the dog's fur. Slowly, back and forth. Ember closed his eyes, sighed. That deep, bottomless sigh of contentment that had made Beth laugh on the first night she brought him home from the dump. The boy's hand kept moving, back and forth through the warm fur. And slowly, so slowly you could only see it if you were watching closely, the rigidity left his body. His shoulders dropped, his breathing deepened. His eyes focused on the dog's face and stayed there. He was coming back, one stroke at a time. Returning from the place the storm had sent him, following the warmth of a dog's body like a path through the dark. In the deepest hours of the night, the confessions came. It happens in darkness when people are pressed together and afraid and stripped of every pretense daylight allows. The masks come off, not because people choose to remove them, but because there's simply no energy left to hold them in place. Pastor George spoke first, sitting near the entrance with his back against the earthen wall, his wife asleep on his shoulder. "I told you only God knows the weather." His voice quiet, meant for Beth but audible to everyone in the small space. "I told you to pray instead of prepare. I was wrong, I was proud. I used God's name to excuse my own unwillingness, to listen to a child who knew more than I did. That's not faith, that's pride dressed in Sunday clothes." He paused. "I owe Beth an apology. I owe it publicly because my failing was public." The dugout was quiet. Some people nodded, some looked at their hands. Brandon Scott cleared his throat, the 19-year-old from the betting pool. The one who'd called Beth the grave girl scared of sunshine. "I bet 50 cents you wouldn't make it to Christmas." His voice raw. "I thought it was funny. I thought you were a joke, a girl in a hole playing house." He stopped, looked at the floor. "I'm alive right now because of that hole. And I'm sorry." Ryan Davis didn't speak for a long time. Then, very quietly, "I'm sorry too." Sharon Clark, holding her son who was still petting Ember, didn't speak. She would never speak an apology. Not in words. That wasn't who she was. But in the months that followed, she would bring food to Beth's dugout every week, without being asked, would never mention the grave again, would never explain why, and everyone in Elkhorn would understand that this was Sharon's way of saying what her mouth couldn't. Near dawn of the second day, Jonathan Miller arrived. He'd been at the forge in Elkhorn when the storm hit. Sheltered there through the first night, the forge's brick walls and residual heat from the coals keeping him alive. But when morning came and the storm showed no sign of breaking, he thought of Beth, alone in her dugout. He also thought of Kathleen Wright, 3 miles from town, alone, sick, in a sod house that might or might not hold against 70-mile winds. He went to Kathleen first. The walk nearly killed him. 1 mile through whiteout conditions that turned the world into a howling white void where direction ceased to exist. And every step was an act of faith. He found the sod house by following the fence line with his bare hand, post by post by post, the wire cutting into his palm through frozen gloves until the wall appeared like a ghost out of the white. Kathleen was inside, wrapped in blankets beside a fire that had gone out hours ago. The cold had crept in through the walls like water through cracks. She was conscious, but barely, too weak to stand, too cold to speak above a whisper. Her lips the color of slate, fingers wouldn't uncurl from the blanket she was gripping. Jonathan carried her, wrapped her in everything he could find, lifted her onto his back, walked out into the storm, 1 mile back to the road. Then 3 miles south to the dugout, 4 miles total, with a 71-year-old woman on the back of a 17-year-old blacksmith, moving through a blizzard that had already killed at least 3 people in Elkhorn. People they wouldn't find until the snow melted in spring. He pounded on the dugout entrance with a fist so numb he couldn't feel the wood. Beth opened the door. Warm air, vapor. And there was Jonathan with Kathleen on his back, both of them coated in ice, both of them alive, because the boy was too stubborn and the woman was too tough. and neither of them had any intention of dying in a Nebraska blizzard. 17 people became 19. The dugout was beyond capacity by any reasonable measure. But the tiles still held at 200 degrees. The earth still held at 55. The fire still drew cleanly through the channel, and the people who had no reason to be alive were alive, because a dead man had dreamed about heating systems, and his daughter had remembered every word. Kathleen was placed on the sleeping platform next to the Martinez children. She was cold and exhausted, but her eyes were clear. She looked around the packed dugout, saw the children sleeping on warm boards, saw the adults against the walls, saw the dog with the traumatized boy, saw Beth feeding the fire with careful precision. Your father would be proud. Kathleen's voice thin but steady. You finished what he started. Beth didn't answer. She placed another piece of wood in the firebox, watched the smoke enter the tiles, watched the heat begin its 14-foot journey through clay. The same journey it had made 1,000 times since October. The same physics, the same patience, the same promise her father had made to the earth, and the earth had kept. Jonathan sat down beside her, close enough that she could feel the cold still radiating off his coat, and beneath it the warmth of someone who'd walked 8 miles through a blizzard, carrying an old woman on his back, because that was the kind of person he was. After everyone was asleep, after the fire had settled into its steady rhythm, and the storm had become background noise that the sleeping bodies had absorbed into their dreams, Jonathan's hand found Beth's in the dark. She didn't pull away. They sat like that for a long time, shoulder to shoulder against the earthen wall, hands intertwined, listening to 19 people breathe in their sleep. Beth leaned her head against Jonathan's shoulder, just for a moment, just long enough to feel what it was like to not carry everything alone. On the morning of the third day, the storm began to weaken. The roar above them softened from a scream to a moan. The pressure in Beth's ears eased. Ember, who hadn't approached the entrance ramp, in 3 days walked halfway up and stood there, ears forward, listening Becky's fever, which had spiked during the second night as her body fought the damage the cold had done, broke just before dawn. Patricia felt the child's forehead. The heat was gone. The sweat was drying. The small face was peaceful. The fever broke. Patricia's voice thick with relief. She's through it. The words moved through the crowded dugout like a wave. People who'd been holding their breath for 3 days exhaled. Someone laughed. Someone else cried. The sounds mixed together in the underground air and became something that was neither laughter nor grief, but both at once. 19 people. 19 lives held together by clay tiles and river stones, and the knowledge of a man who died 2 years ago in a diphtheria epidemic, and whose legacy was a warm floor in a hole in the ground. Morning of December 17. The storm ended, didn't fade, stopped. One moment the roar was there, vibrating through the earth above the dugout like a living thing. The next moment it was gone. The silence that replaced it was so complete and so sudden that several people woke from sleep, believing something had gone wrong. Nothing had gone wrong. Something had finally gone right. Beth climbed the entrance ramp, dug through 3 feet of packed snow with her bare hands. Ember scrambled up behind her, clawing at the snow with his front paws. Urgent now, desperate for the open air he'd refused to enter 3 days ago. She broke through into morning light so bright it hurt. The world was white. Not the white of normal snowfall, clean and even. This was the white of destruction. Drifts 20 feet high against the windward side of every structure. Fence posts buried. Trees stripped of branches. The prairie, which 3 days ago had been brown winter grass stretching to the horizon, was now an unbroken field of snow, so vast and so flat it looked like the earth had been erased and redrawn in a single color. She stood at the top of the ramp, looked toward Elkhorn, couldn't see the town. 4 miles away and invisible, buried. One by one the others climbed out behind her, blinking, squinting, holding their hands up against the sun. They stood in a ragged line on the snow-covered prairie, looked at what the storm had done, and none of them spoke for a long time. Christopher was the first to move, started walking toward town. Patricia followed with the children, then the Clarks, then Pastor George and his family, then the 2 young men. They walked in single file through snow that reached their waists in places. Following the trail Christopher broke with his body, Beth stayed behind, with Kathleen and Jonathan and Ember. Watched them go. 17 people who'd entered her dugout on their knees, were now walking upright towards a town that would never look at them, or at her. The same way again. The damage in Elkhorn was severe. 3 houses had lost roofs entirely. 7 more had structural damage that made them uninhabitable until repaired. The church had lost every window on the north side. The general store's porch had been ripped away and deposited in pieces across Main Street. Livestock had frozen in barns that failed. A milk cow belonging to the Johansson family was found standing dead in her stall. Frozen solid, still upright. 3 people had died. The town learned their names one by one over the following days. Margaret Weiss, 72, who lived alone at the east end of town. Found in her bed by her nephew on the morning of December 18. The house had held. But her stove had gone out sometime during the second night, and she hadn't had the strength to relight it. She'd pulled every blanket she owned over herself and gone to sleep. And the cold had taken her quietly while she dreamed. Her cat was found alive beside her, pressed against her body, surviving on the last warmth she had to give. Tobias Kern, 44, a bachelor farmer 2 miles north, found in his barn by a search party on the 19th. He'd gone out during the first night to check on his horses, and the wind had turned him around. He made it to the barn but couldn't find his way back to the house. 30 yards. He froze 30 yards from his own front door. They found his footprints in the snow the next day. Circling. A man walking in loops 15 feet from safety. Blind in the white, and Walter Calloway. They found him on the afternoon of December 18, after a search party dug through the drift that had buried his cottage to the roofline. He was in his rocking chair, blanket on his knees. Eyes closed. The stove was cold. The woodpile beside it was full. He hadn't run out of fuel. He'd simply stopped feeding the fire at some point during the second night. Whether from exhaustion or confusion, or the particular surrender that it comes. When a man who has survived everything finally meets the thing he cannot survive. Nobody would ever know. His hands were folded in his lap. His face was calm. If you didn't know he was dead, you might have thought he was sleeping. Beth heard the news from Jonathan, who'd gone into town to help with recovery. She was sitting on the entrance ramp of the dugout with Ember beside her when he told her. She didn't cry immediately. She sat very still. Looked at the snow-covered prairie. Remembered the old man's pale blue eyes. His voice saying, "I've survived 50 winters." The way he'd looked at her from his porch, as though her concern was an insult to his history. Then she cried. Not for long. Not the way she'd cried in the dark when she thought about giving up. This was a different kind of grief. Grief for a man she barely knew who'd died, because he wouldn't accept help from someone he believed was beneath him. Grief for the waste of it. A full wood pile and a cold stove, and a man too proud to walk 4 miles to a warm floor. I should have tried harder. Her voice breaking, Kathleen, who was sitting in the entrance wrapped in blankets and sunlight, shook her head slowly. You told him. You walked to his house and told him. He chose. That choice was his, not yours. Carry the sadness if you must. But don't carry the blame. It doesn't belong to you. Beth wiped her eyes. Ember put his head on her knee. The weight of it, solid, real, anchoring her to now instead of what if. The apologies came over the following days. Each one different. Each one carrying its own weight. Pastor George stood before his congregation on the first Sunday after the storm. I told a 15-year-old girl that only God knows the weather. I was using scripture to avoid admitting that a child understood something I did not. That's not faith. That's pride dressed in Sunday clothes. I owe Beth an apology. I owe it publicly because my failing was public. The congregation was quiet. Some nodded. Some looked at their hands. But everyone understood. The ground had shifted. In ways that couldn't be undone. Brandon Scott found Beth at the general store 3 days after the storm, stood in front of her with his hat in his hands and his eyes on the floor. I called you the grave girl. I bet money on when you'd die. I made a joke out of your life when you were fighting to keep it. He looked up. You're the bravest person I've ever met, and I'm ashamed of what I did. Beth looked at him for a long moment. He was 19, barely older than she was, scared and young and sorry in the way that only someone who's recently understood the size of their own cruelty can be sorry. Don't bet on people's lives anymore. That's enough. He nodded, walked away quickly, and she didn't see him cry, but she heard it, just briefly, before the wind took the sound. Inspector Kenneth Taylor returned on December 22. Didn't come to evaluate. This time came with a document. a formal certificate of land improvement, recognizing Beth's claim to the quarter section under territorial squatters' rights. The document noted habitable structure with demonstrated heating capability and evidence of sustained agricultural improvement. This is your land. Kenneth's voice official, formally. No one can take it from you. He shook her hand, his grip firm and formal, and when he let go, he paused, said very quietly, 19 people. I put that in my report too. Christmas Eve. Christopher Martinez came. Beth saw him from the entrance ramp, walking across the snow toward the dugout in the late afternoon light. Alone this time. No children, no Patricia. Just a big man in a heavy coat moving slowly through the drifts. She waited at the top of the ramp. Ember stood beside her, ears forward. But he didn't growl. Even the dog seemed to understand that this wasn't a threat. This was an ending. Christopher stopped 10 feet away. An instance he'd stood at in November, when he'd threatened to take her land. But everything between them had changed. And the 10 feet felt different now, wider in some ways, narrower in others. The heating system works. Not a question. A statement I know. I want to install it in my house. The tile system, under the sleeping area. Using the stove exhaust, I can show you how. He nodded. Looked at the ground, looked at the sky. Looked everywhere except at her face. I was wrong about the dugout. The words came out stiff, forced, like pulling splinters. Beth waited. She waited for the rest of it. For the words that would complete the sentence. I was wrong about you. I was wrong to throw you out. I was wrong to tell you your father left you nothing when he left you everything that mattered. The words didn't come. Christopher Martinez was a man who could admit he'd been wrong about engineering, about clay tiles and floor heating, and the physics of waste heat recovery. Those were facts. Facts could be admitted without cost, because they didn't require a man to look at himself and see something he couldn't bear to see. But admitting he'd been wrong about a person, about a 15-year-old girl he'd sent into the cold because she was inconvenient, that required a different kind of courage, the kind Christopher Martinez didn't have, and perhaps would never have. I was wrong about the dugout. He said it again, as though repeating it might somehow fill the space where the rest of the apology should have been. Beth looked at him. She thought about August 28. The $9. The blanket. The sentence that had lived in her chest like a splinter for 4 months. Your father died in debt and left you nothing. Her father had left her everything, then go. She said it quietly, without anger, without satisfaction. Just go. Christopher turned, walked back across the snow. Didn't look back. She watched him until he was a dark shape against the white horizon. Then until he was nothing at all. She never saw him again. He installed the floor heating system in January. Using her design, it cut his fuel costs by 60%. He never told anyone where he'd learned it. Never spoke her name in public. Never acknowledged, in any way, another person could witness that a 15-year-old girl he'd discarded had saved his family and changed his understanding of warmth and shelter, and what it means to build something that lasts. He moved to Kansas in the spring of 1885. Took Patricia and the 6 children with him. Beth received one letter from Patricia. Months later, written in a careful hand that suggested each word had been chosen and reconsidered several times. I'm sorry. I hope you're well. Nothing more. Some people don't change. That's not a failure of the person who was wronged. It simply is a fact. The way gravity is a fact. And learning to accept it without bitterness is its own kind of strength. Beth accepted it, then went inside, built a fire, fed Ember, sat on the warm platform, began planning what she would build next. By February of 1884, 6 families in Elkhorn had asked Beth to consult on heating systems. She walked them through the principles: tile placement, chimney draft, the angle of descent, the ratio of clay to sand in the joint mortar, the depth of earth cover, the importance of river stones for thermal mass. She explained it patiently, the way her father had explained it to her. And people listened now. People listened because 19 of them were alive and 3 were not. And the difference between those numbers was a floor heating system built by a 15-year-old girl with $9. Jonathan helped with the installations. Forged custom brackets and grates and chimney caps at the smithy, brought them to each house. Didn't charge for his labor. And when Beth asked why, he said, because you didn't charge for yours. By spring, Elkhorn was different. Not transformed, not reborn. Just different in the quiet way towns change when they've been through something together that none of them can forget. People nodded to Beth on the street, held doors, offered work, real work, not charity. The name Williams's Folly disappeared from the map behind the general store counter. Donald Harris scraped it off himself, didn't replace it with anything. Beth lived in her dugout until 1886, when she turned 18 and filed her official homestead claim. The land that nobody wanted became hers by law. She built a house above ground that year. A proper frame house with glass windows and a wood floor, but she built it with floor heating. Clay tiles running from the kitchen stove through channels beneath the bedroom and parlor. The same principle, the same physics, the same gift from her father. She married Jonathan Miller in the spring of 1887. In a ceremony held inside the dugout, Pastor George officiated. Kathleen sat in the corner on the sleeping platform and wept openly. Told everyone it was allergies. Ember wore a ribbon around his neck that one of the Martinez girls had left behind. Barked once during the vows, which everyone agreed was approval. By 1890, 22 houses in the Elkhorn area used floor heating systems based on Beth's design. She taught anyone who asked. Never charged. Knowledge that saves lives is not something you sell. She told Jonathan once, it's something you give away, as fast as you can, because in the end, that's what her father had done. Given her knowledge. Not money, not land, not anything Christopher Martinez would count as inheritance, but knowledge, which turned out to be the only thing that mattered. The only thing that couldn't be foreclosed or stolen or lost to diphtheria or doubt. The earth never lies. That's what Robert Williams had taught her. And Beth had proved it. With blistered hands and bleeding determination, and 19 people sleeping on a warm floor in the middle of winter, she proved that sometimes the things people call impossible are just things they haven't bothered to understand yet.
Uns hier die Mitte rausstellen, weißt du? Wir müssen irgendwas einnehmen. Wir können die nicht so viel. Wir kriegen zu viel Space for free. Deswegen haben die es gerade so easy.
Mach immer deine Wall.
Genau, ich mach meine Wall.
Oder so, ja.
So, du gehst so durch, geht auch ohne Drohne.
Ja, die Runde will ich Drohne sparen.
Ja, mach mal.
Oh, Pistol so.
Ich glaube, das ist schon hier oben.
Es war jetzt erstmal niemand.
Ah, ist Flash. Ja, sind raus. Und Onside. Ah, Jetpit weg. Oben auf der Kiste hier. Net 110.
Auf Yellow drauf oder Orange? Bisschen runter.
Einer ist am Main.
Yellow.
Ben hat am Main gecheckt.